I know about the stolen money, and I have the flash drive. The text read, her fingers trembling over the cracked screen. If you don't pay for his surgery tonight, I'm sending everything to the police. I have nothing left to lose. Alexa hit send, exhaling a ragged breath. She waited for the arrogant reply from the man who ruined her life. Instead, 3 gray dots appeared. Then, a single, chilling response. You have 30 seconds to come outside before we take the door off its hinges. The sudden roar of heavy engines vibrated through the floorboards. Alexa rushed to the window. 5 matte black SUVs had just surrounded her tiny house. The diner smelled of burnt coffee, industrial bleach, and the lingering despair of the midnight shift. Alexa stood behind the scuffed Formica counter, a damp rag clutched in her raw, aching hands. Rain lashed against the large front windows, distorting the neon glow of the streetlights into bleeding streaks of red and yellow. It was 2:14 a.m., and the exhaustion settled deep into her bones. A heavy, physical weight that made every movement feel like wading through wet cement. She wiped down the same spot on the counter for the 3rd time, her eyes repeatedly darting to the cheap digital clock above the swinging kitchen doors. Time was a luxury she no longer possessed. Every passing minute was a grain of sand falling through the hourglass of her little brother's life. In the pocket of her faded, stain-spattered apron, her phone felt heavier than a brick. It was a lifeline and an anchor, tethering her to a reality that was rapidly collapsing. Her brother, barely 10 years old, was lying in a sterile hospital bed across town, his lungs failing, his skin translucent. The surgery he needed, the only procedure that could save his life, cost a sum so astronomical it felt like a sick joke. But the cruelest part was that the money had existed. It had been there, saved painstakingly over years of double shifts, sold heirlooms, and scraped-together pennies. And then, it was gone, stolen by the man she had trusted, the man who had manipulated his way into their lives and vanished into the city's criminal underbelly with their only hope. Alexa walked into the cramped, flickering light of the break room. She leaned against the cold metal of the staff lockers, squeezing her eyes shut as a fresh wave of panic threatened to pull her under. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the phone. The screen was cracked, a spiderweb of shattered glass that distorted the numbers on the screen. She opened the messaging app, staring at the contact she had saved only under a single initial. D, the man who had taken everything. He had laughed at her last plea, told her she was a nobody, a ghost crying in the wind. But he didn't know she had found something before he left. A small, innocuous black USB drive tucked beneath a loose floorboard in his old apartment. She had plugged it in just once, long enough to see files, ledgers, and names that terrified her. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was crossing a line, stepping out of the agonizing safety of victimhood and into the dangerous territory of a threat. But as the image of her brother's frail, sleeping face flashed in her mind, the fear crystallized into a cold, hard resolve. She typed the message out, her fingers clumsy, slipping on the shattered glass. She didn't check the number. She had copied it frantically from a scrap of paper he had left behind weeks ago, a number he claimed was his new, secure line. She read the words back to herself. I know about the stolen money, and I have the flash drive. If you don't pay for his surgery tonight, I'm sending everything to the police. I have nothing left to lose. It was a bluff. Going to the police with evidence of a massive criminal syndicate would likely get her killed before it ever helped her brother. But she needed him to panic. She needed him to pay. Alexa closed her eyes, took a deep, shuddering breath, and pressed send. The little swoosh sound of the message departing felt final, like the slamming of a vault door. She stared at the screen, watching the delivery status. Delivered. Her breath hitched. She waited. Seconds stretched into an eternity. The rain outside seemed to amplify, beating a frantic rhythm against the diner's roof. She expected a phone call, a stream of vicious curses. Perhaps a mocking laugh track sent as an audio file. She knew his cruelty intimately. Instead, the screen illuminated. 3 small, pulsating gray dots appeared in the bottom left corner. He was typing. Alexa gripped the edge of the locker, her knuckles turning white. The dots vanished. Then, a single message materialized on the screen. It wasn't the rambling, abusive tirade she had anticipated. It was perfectly punctuated, utterly cold, and entirely devoid of the brash arrogance she recognized. You have 30 seconds to come outside before we take the door off its hinges." A profound, icy dread washed over her. That wasn't him. The tone was completely wrong. It lacked his hot-headed bravado. This message was clinical, precise, and carried the crushing weight of absolute authority. Before her mind could even process the magnitude of the error, the floorboards beneath her boots began to vibrate. It started as a low, guttural hum and quickly escalated into a synchronized mechanical roar that drowned out the pounding rain. Alexa pushed herself off the lockers and stumbled out of the break room, her apron strings catching on the doorframe. She practically threw herself against the front windows of the diner, peering through the neon-tinted rain. Out in the desolate, pothole-riddled parking lot, the night had been swallowed by shadows. 5 massive, matte black SUVs had materialized out of the storm, moving in absolute unison. They didn't park. They formed a tactical barricade, cutting off every angle of escape. Their blinding, high-beam headlights flared to life simultaneously, illuminating the diner in a harsh, unforgiving glare. Alexa stood frozen behind the glass, the phone slipping from her numb fingers and clattering to the floor. She hadn't texted the thief. She had texted the devil himself. The sheer scale of the operation unfolding outside the diner's window paralyzed Alexa. The rain fell in heavy, relentless sheets, bouncing off the armored hoods of the black SUVs. But the vehicles themselves sat completely motionless, radiating a silent, predatory menace. The engines hummed with a deep, suppressed power, a sound that resonated in Alexa's chest cavity, making it hard to breathe. The 30 seconds were evaporating. She felt the sudden, terrifying realization that her life, as she knew it, was effectively over. The heavy, reinforced doors of the lead SUV swung open in perfect synchronicity. Men began to pour out into the storm. They were not street thugs. They moved with the fluid, calculated discipline of a military strike team. They were dressed in dark, tailored overcoats, their faces obscured by the shadows and the driving rain, but the glint of steel in their hands was unmistakable. They didn't shout or scramble. They simply took their positions, forming an impenetrable perimeter around the small, glowing box of the diner. Alexa's mind fragmented. Flight or fight kicked in, but there was nowhere to run and nothing to fight with. She backed away from the window, her boots squeaking against the freshly mopped linoleum. "Oh God, oh God," she whispered, the sound entirely lost in the ambient noise of the diner's old refrigerators. She spun around, her eyes darting toward the kitchen, the back alley door, but even as the thought formed, she saw the beams of heavy tactical flashlights sweeping across the frosted glass of the rear exit. They had already surrounded the building. She was trapped in a glass cage. Then, the rear door of the center SUV opened. The men who had already deployed seemed to subtly shift, their posture stiffening, creating a wide, respectful path. A man stepped out into the downpour. Unlike his soldiers, he didn't rush or hunch his shoulders against the cold. He moved with a deliberate, terrifying grace. He wore a sharp, charcoal gray suit that seemed immune to the weather, a dark trench coat draped over his shoulders. As he walked toward the diner, the high beams caught his face. It was a face carved from granite, lined with the harsh architecture of a life spent dealing in violence and absolute power. His dark eyes were fixed dead ahead, locked onto the diner's front door with a predatory focus. This was Jose, the phantom that ruled the city's underground, the name spoken only in hushed, terrified whispers by the men who had stolen from her. Alexa scrambled backward, her hip violently striking the edge of a booth. The pain barely registered. The 30 seconds were up. The front door of the diner didn't just open. It exploded inward. The heavy glass spiderwebbed and shattered into thousands of diamond-like fragments, showering the entryway as the lock gave way under a massive, synchronized breach. The wind and rain howled into the diner, instantly extinguishing the warmth and bringing the smell of wet asphalt and impending doom. 3 heavily armed men flooded into the room, their weapons raised, their movements precise and sweeping. Clear left, one barked. Clear right, another echoed. They bypassed the empty booths and converged on the center of the room, their weapons instantly finding the only target. Alexa stood trembling by the counter, her hands raised instinctively, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The laser sights of their weapons painted small, trembling red dots across her chest and forehead. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the concussive crack of gunfire, the sudden, final darkness. She prayed her brother would somehow survive without her. that the state would take pity on him. Hold. The voice cut through the chaos like a razor blade. It wasn't a shout. It was spoken at a normal, conversational volume, yet it possessed a resonant authority that instantly froze every man in the room. Alexa opened her eyes. The soldiers had lowered their weapons a fraction of an inch, parting to allow their leader to step forward. Jose stood in the ruined entryway, the storm raging behind him, framing him in a halo of streetlights and rain. He slowly reached up and brushed a stray droplet of water from the lapel of his coat. His gaze fell upon Alexa, sweeping over her stained uniform, her terrified face, and the shattered phone lying on the floor near her feet. The absolute silence in the diner was deafening, broken only by the crunch of glass beneath Jose's expensive leather shoes as he took a slow, deliberate step forward. He didn't look like a man who had come to negotiate. He looked like an executioner who had found the wrong victim on the block. He stopped 10 feet away from her. The air between them felt thick, charged with lethal electricity. He tilted his head slightly, studying her with a terrifying, unblinking intensity. He saw the terror in her eyes, the trembling of her hands, the absolute lack of any threat she posed. "You have a very strange definition of having nothing left to lose," Jose said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated through the silent room. "Where's the drive?" Alexa's jaw worked, but no sound came out. Her throat had closed entirely. The sheer, suffocating presence of the man was overriding her basic motor functions. She looked at his men, then back at him, her mind frantically trying to bridge the gap between her stolen medical fund and the arrival of a paramilitary cartel. I, she stammered, tears finally breaking free and spilling hot down her freezing cheeks. "I didn't mean, it wasn't for you." Jose's eyes narrowed, a subtle, dangerous shift in his expression. "I do not deal in accidents," he stated coldly. He gestured slightly with one hand. A soldier instantly stepped forward, picked up Alexa's shattered phone from the floor, and handed it to him. Jose looked down at the cracked screen, tapping it once to bring up the messaging app. He read the text she had sent. He read the number she had sent it to. Then, very slowly, he looked back up at her, the lethal calm in his eyes replaced by a sudden, razor-sharp calculation. The diner was a tableau of suspended violence. The wind howled through the shattered front door, rattling the cheap tin napkin dispensers on the counters. But inside, the atmosphere was suffocatingly still. Jose held Alexa's ruined phone in his large, scarred hand, his eyes moving methodically from the glowing text on the screen to the trembling woman standing before him. "You sent this," Jose said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its initial edge of immediate violence and replacing it with a cold, investigative curiosity. "It wasn't a question." Alexa nodded frantically, her hands still hovering defensively in the air. Yes, but I typed the wrong number. Or he gave me a fake one. I swear to God, I don't know who you are. I wasn't threatening you. Please, you have to believe me." Jose didn't blink. He slowly slipped the phone into the inner pocket of his trench coat. Who is he? The command was absolute. There was no room for evasion, no space for lies. Alexa felt the oppressive weight of his gaze pinning her to the linoleum. Her mind raced, terrifying scenarios playing out in rapid succession. If she gave up the name, she was signing a death warrant. If she didn't, her own life would end right here, on the grease-stained floor of her workplace. My ex-boyfriend. Alexa choked out, her voice barely a whisper against the storm. "He stole from me. He took the money I had saved for my little brother's surgery. He emptied the account and disappeared. I was just trying to scare him into giving it back." One of the armed men behind Jose scoffed softly, a brief, harsh sound of disbelief. Jose didn't even turn his head, but he raised a single finger. The man instantly fell silent, stiffening into absolute stillness. A waitress trying to extort a thief for a medical fund. Jose mused, the words heavy on his tongue. He took another step closer. Alexa instinctively shrank back, pressing her spine against the edge of the counter. It is a touching narrative, but it lacks a crucial element. This text. He tapped the pocket where the phone now rested. Mentions a flash drive. It mentions going to the police. A simple thief stealing a few $1,000s does not warrant this level of leverage. What is on the drive? Alexa hesitated. The drive was her only collateral, the only thing keeping her brother's faint hope alive. But looking into Jose's eyes, dark, bottomless, Completely devoid of mercy, she realized the drive was also a ticking bomb. Records, she whispered, her voice breaking. Spreadsheets, offshore bank routing numbers, ledgers about shipments. I don't understand most of it, but I know it's illegal. I know it's worth a lot more than what he stole from me. Jose's expression remained entirely impassive, but Alexa noticed a micro-shift in his posture. The predatory tension in his shoulders tightened. The air in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. He was no longer looking at her as a random nuisance. He was looking at her as a puzzle piece that had just fallen onto the wrong board. "Give me his name," Jose demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, terrifying hush. "If I tell you, you'll kill him." Alexa sobbed, the moral weight of the situation crushing her despite what the man had done to her. "And I'll never get the money back. My brother will die. Please, just let me go." Jose closed the final few feet between them. He towered over her, blocking out the light, blocking out the storm. Up close, she could smell rain, expensive cologne, and the faint, metallic scent of gun oil. "Look at me," he commanded softly. Alexa forced her eyes upward, meeting his gaze. "If this man has files matching your description," Jose said slowly, articulating every syllable with lethal precision, "then the money he stole from you is the least of his sins. The man you are trying to blackmail did not just rob you. He is stealing from me, and he is using my infrastructure to hide it. Now, you will give me his name, or my men will tear this city apart, and you will be the first casualty of the war." The revelation hit Alexa like a physical blow. The scale of the danger she had stepped into was incomprehensible. She hadn't just poked a hornet's nest. She had accidentally wandered into a battlefield between apex predators. Her ex wasn't just a sleazy con man. He was embedded in a cartel. "David," she gasped, the name tearing from her throat as she surrendered the last piece of her leverage. "His name is David Vance. He ran the logistics office downtown. He told me he was an accountant." The silence that followed was absolute. The name hung in the damp air, heavy and lethal. Jose didn't move. He didn't speak. But the reaction from the men in the room was instantaneous. The rigid discipline cracked for a fraction of a second. The soldiers exchanged rapid, tense glances. The name meant something to them. It meant something massive. Jose slowly closed his eyes. A long, slow breath escaped his lips. When he opened them again, the cold, calculating mafioso had vanished, replaced by something much more terrifying. A man who had just discovered a viper in his own bed. "David Vance is my chief logistical coordinator," Jose said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. A dead, flat calm that promised apocalyptic violence. "He manages the Port Authority bribes. He moves $50 million of my product a month." He stepped back, creating a sudden, jarring distance between them. He looked around the shabby diner, as if seeing it for the first time, then back at the terrified waitress who had inadvertently unraveled a massive internal betrayal. "Where is the drive?" Jose asked again. But this time, it wasn't an interrogation. It was a partnership born in hell. "Show me." The dynamic in the diner shattered and reformed in the span of a single heartbeat. The laser sights painting Alexa's chest blinked out of existence. The soldiers lowered their rifles, though their posture remained coiled, their eyes darting nervously toward their boss. They had arrived expecting to execute a rival or silence a blackmailer. Instead, they had just been handed the horrific truth that their own high command was compromised. Jose turned away from Alexa, pacing a tight circle in the center of the room. The crunch of shattered glass under his shoes was the only sound. He was processing the intelligence, slotting Alexa's desperate confession into the broader architecture of his criminal empire. Alexa remained frozen against the counter, her mind struggling to catch up. She had expected to die. Instead, the most dangerous man in the city was pacing her diner, digesting the fact that her ex-boyfriend was a traitor. 3 shipments, Jose muttered, almost to himself, though his voice carried effortlessly through the quiet room. 3 shipments in the last quarter intercepted by the Port Authority. We assumed a leak. We bled the docks dry looking for the rat. He stopped pacing and looked back at Alexa. He wasn't leaking the manifest to the authorities. He was ghosting the shipments, selling them to rivals, and cooking the ledgers to make it look like a seizure. He wasn't speaking to her so much as thinking aloud, mapping the anatomy of the betrayal. But as he spoke, Alexa felt a strange, terrifying shift in her own perception. She was no longer a victim standing before a monster. She was a witness providing critical intelligence to a warlord. He told me he was stressed, Alexa said, her voice shaky but gaining a fraction of strength. He said the new bosses were demanding impossible margins, that he had to set up fail-safes. That's what he called the drive. A fail-safe. Jose's eyes snapped back to her, sharp and piercing. He kept a ledger of his own theft, arrogant and profoundly stupid. He took a slow breath, the fury rolling off him in palpable waves. He stole from you to cover a gap? To pay for logistics to move his stolen product? No, Alexa said, the sting of the betrayal bringing fresh tears to her eyes. He didn't need my money. He had millions, apparently. He stole my brother's surgery fund because it was there. Because he was leaving, and he could. It was $80,000. To him, it was pocket change. To me, it was my brother's life. A heavy silence descended on the room. The sheer, petty cruelty of the act seemed to register with the heavily armed men standing guard. In their world, violence and theft were business. But stealing a child's medical fund purely out of spite violated a code even they understood. Jose stared at her. The cold calculation in his eyes softened for a microscopic fraction of a second, replaced by a profound, dark understanding. He recognized the anatomy of that kind of cruelty. It was the mark of a man without a soul. A man who would betray a cartel just as easily as he would a desperate woman. $80,000, Jose repeated softly. He reached into his coat and pulled out a sleek, encrypted satellite phone. He dialed a single number, holding the device to his ear. Lock down the city, Jose ordered into the phone, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. Seal the ports. Ground the private charters. Put a full surveillance net on Vance's properties, his safe houses, his offshore accounts. Do not touch him. Do not let him know he is being watched. I want him boxed in. He hung up the phone and slipped it back into his pocket. He turned his full attention back to Alexa. The threat of immediate death had passed, but the danger had only mutated. She was now the only civilian holding the key to a massive underworld war. You are going to take me to the drive, Jose stated. It wasn't a request. Alexa swallowed hard. It's not here. I didn't bring it to work. I hid it. Where? In my apartment. She lied instinctively, a sudden surge of protective panic washing over her. Her brother was at the hospital, but her apartment was her sanctuary. She didn't want these men tearing through her meager life. Jose stepped closer, his dark eyes locking onto hers, seeing right through the fragile deception. Do not lie to me, Alexa, he said softly. Using her name for the first time, the sound of it on his lips sent a shiver down her spine. I can see your heart beating against your ribs. The drive is not at your apartment. If it was, you would have been looking toward the door, calculating the distance. You looked toward the kitchen. Alexa's breath hitched. He was terrifyingly perceptive. I am not your enemy, Jose continued, his voice dropping to a hypnotic, reassuring timbre that was somehow more frightening than his anger. David Vance is our mutual problem. He took your brother's life. He took my property. We are going to retrieve the drive, and then we are going to dismantle his life, piece by piece. He extended a hand toward the swinging kitchen doors. Show me. Alexa looked at the heavy, scarred hand, then up at his face. There was no escaping this. She pushed off the counter, her legs feeling like lead, and walked slowly toward the back of the diner. Jose followed closely, his men fanning out behind them, securing the perimeter. She pushed through the swinging doors into the dark, greasy kitchen. The smell of old fry oil and raw onions was overwhelming. She walked past the heavy steel prep tables, her boots slipping slightly on the grimy floor, leading the most dangerous men in the city toward the walk-in freezer. The kitchen was a labyrinth of stainless steel and deep shadows, illuminated only by the pale, ambient light bleeding in from the ruined front of the diner. Alexa moved through the narrow aisles with the muscle memory of 1,000 grueling shifts, but the presence of the men behind her altered the gravity of the room. Jose walked in absolute silence, his heavy footfalls making no sound on the grease-slicked tiles, a ghost in a bespoke suit. His soldiers swept the corners with their weapons, clearing the mundane space, as if expecting an ambush from behind the industrial mixers. Alexa stopped in front of the massive stainless steel door of the walk-in freezer. The heavy latch was coated in a thin layer of frost. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the handle. It's cold, she whispered, a sudden, irrational need to warn them. Open it. Jose commanded softly from directly behind her. She gripped the latch, threw her weight backward, and pulled. The heavy door swung open with a pneumatic hiss, releasing a thick plume of freezing white vapor into the stifling kitchen air. The temperature plummeted instantly. The internal lights of the freezer flickered on, casting a harsh, blue-white glare over rows of hanging meat, boxes of frozen vegetables, and industrial-sized tubs of soup base. Alexa stepped into the freezing mist, her breath immediately pluming in the air. She walked past the main shelves, moving toward the very back corner, where the frost was thickest and the inventory was rarely rotated. She knelt down on the freezing metal grate of the floor, shivering violently as the cold seeped through her thin uniform. Jose stepped into the freezer behind her, the heavy door slowly swinging shut but caught by one of his men, who wedged a combat boot in the frame to keep it ajar. Jose watched her intently, his dark eyes tracking her every movement in the claustrophobic, icy space. Alexa reached behind a stack of massive, frozen beef flanks, her fingers numb and clumsy. She felt the cold, hard surface of the wall, trailing her hand down until she found the small, structural gap between the insulation panels. She dug her fingernails into the crack, scraping against the frost until she felt the familiar, rough texture of heavy-duty duct tape. I taped it behind the paneling, she said, her teeth beginning to chatter. He tore apart my apartment before he left. He was looking for it. He didn't know I brought it to work. She peeled the tape back with a sharp ripping sound that echoed loudly in the small space. A small black plastic rectangle fell into her palm. The USB drive. It looked entirely unremarkable, a cheap piece of plastic that could have held family photos or bad music. Instead, it held the keys to an empire and the fate of her brother's life. She stood up slowly, her knees stiff from the cold, and turned to face Jose. She held the drive out in her open palm. Jose looked at the small black object for a long moment. He didn't reach for it immediately. He looked at Alexa's face, pale and shivering, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. He saw the sheer force of will it had taken for a civilian to steal from a cartel lieutenant, to hide the evidence in a meat freezer, and to attempt to use it as leverage. He recognized a profound, reckless courage that he rarely encountered in his world of calculated risks. He reached out and gently took the drive from her hand. His fingers brushed hers. His skin was warm, completely unaffected by the freezing air. "You are a remarkably dangerous woman, Alexa," Jose said softly, slipping the drive into his coat pocket. "David underestimated you. That will be the last mistake he ever makes. Are you going to pay for the surgery?" Alexa blurted out, the words escaping before she could filter them. The terror was still there, but the desperation was stronger. "You said we had a mutual problem. I gave you the drive. Are you going to give me the money?" Jose's expression remained unreadable. He stepped closer, the freezing vapor swirling around his dark coat. "The money David stole from you is irrelevant. I will burn millions to correct this insult to my organization." He paused, his eyes locked onto hers. "Your brother will have his surgery. The finest doctors. The best facility. I will mandate it personally." A massive, suffocating weight instantly lifted off Alexa's chest, so sudden and powerful that her knees buckled. She staggered, grabbing the edge of the metal shelving to steady herself. A sob tore from her throat, echoing in the icy room. It wasn't a cry of fear. It was the violent release of months of agonizing, suppressed despair. Jose reached out and caught her elbow, stabilizing her with a grip that was surprisingly gentle, given the immense strength she knew he possessed. "We need to leave," Jose said, his voice quiet but urgent. "David is arrogant, but he is not stupid. When he realizes his failsafe is missing, he will trace the leak. This diner is compromised." He guided her out of the freezer, the oppressive heat of the kitchen rushing back over them. But as they emerged, the soldier holding the door suddenly raised a clenched fist. Absolute silence fell over the team. Movement in the alley. The soldier hissed into a lapel mic. 3 vehicles, unmarked, heavy approach. Jose's eyes darkened. The brief moment of alliance was over. The war had officially arrived at their doorstep. "David," he whispered, "a lethal promise. They're breaching the rear," another soldier announced, raising his rifle and aiming it squarely at the heavy steel door at the back of the kitchen. Take them, Jose commanded, his voice cold and flat. He grabbed Alexa by the shoulders and shoved her violently behind a massive stainless steel prep counter, throwing himself down beside her just as the back door exploded inward in a hail of suppressed gunfire. The kitchen erupted into a chaotic symphony of violence. The concussive thuds of suppressed automatic weapons tore through the humid air, pinging off stainless steel surfaces and shattering ceramic plates stacked on the prep tables. Alexa curled into a tight ball on the greasy floor, her hands clamped over her ears, screaming silently as the world disintegrated above her. She felt a heavy weight press against her side. Jose had positioned his body between her and the line of fire, utilizing his armored trench coat as a shield. He wasn't firing a weapon himself. He remained perfectly still, a silent anchor in the storm of bullets, his eyes fixed on his men as they executed a flawless tactical defense. "Flank right, suppressing fire," one of Jose's men shouted. The exchange was brutally short. David's men had expected to find a terrified waitress holding a flash drive. They had walked blindly into the elite vanguard of a cartel boss. Within 40 seconds, the incoming fire ceased abruptly, replaced by the heavy thuds of bodies hitting the linoleum and the agonizing groans of the wounded. "Clear," a soldier barked. "Perimeter secure," another confirmed. Jose slowly rose from the floor, brushing a dusting of flour from his sleeve. He looked down at Alexa, extending a hand. She stared at it, her mind entirely blank with shock. Before slowly reaching up, he pulled her to her feet with effortless strength. She was trembling so violently she could barely stand. "We are leaving." "Now," Jose ordered. The extraction was a blur of flashing lights, rain, and adrenaline. Jose's men formed a tight phalanx around them, rushing them through the shattered front of the diner and into the cavernous rear of the center SUV. The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing them in a world of dark leather and soundproof silence. The convoy accelerated violently, tearing out of the parking lot and vanishing into the labyrinth of the city's rain-slicked streets. Alexa sat huddled in the corner of the plush leather seat, her knees pulled to her chest, shivering uncontrollably. The adrenaline crash was hitting her, leaving her hollow and nauseous. Across from her, Jose sat in total calmness, bathed in the faint blue light of a mounted tactical display. He didn't look like a man who had just survived a firefight. He looked like a CEO reviewing a quarterly report. The drive took nearly 40 minutes, weaving through industrial districts and avoiding main thoroughfares, until the convoy finally descended into a heavily fortified subterranean garage beneath a towering, anonymous high-rise in the city's financial sector. They were escorted up a private elevator that opened directly into a sprawling, ultra-modern penthouse. The space was a stark contrast to the gritty diner. It was all floor-to-ceiling glass, polished concrete, and minimalist, painfully expensive furniture. But despite the luxury, the air was thick with the frenetic energy of a war room. Armed men stood at the perimeter, and in the center of the vast living area, a bank of high-powered servers and curved monitors had been hastily assembled on a massive glass dining table. A young man in a dark hoodie, his face illuminated by the harsh glow of the screens, was frantically typing. He looked up as Jose entered, immediately stiffening. "Boss," the tech said, his voice tight with nervous energy. Jose walked over to the table and tossed the black USB drive onto the glass. It landed with a sharp click. "Decrypt it. Full deep dive. I want every ledger, every routing number, every communication log." The tech snatched up the drive and plugged it into a heavily modified terminal. "Encryption is standard commercial grade." He thought he was being clever, but it's sloppy. "Give me 3 minutes." Jose turned to Alexa. She was standing awkwardly by the elevator, dripping wet water onto the polished concrete floor, looking entirely out of place and terrified. He gestured to a leather sofa near the glass wall, overlooking the city skyline. "Sit," he said, his tone softening marginally. "Bring her a blanket and something hot to drink." He ordered one of the guards. Alexa stumbled to the sofa and collapsed onto it. A guard quickly handed her a thick cashmere throw and a steaming mug of black tea. She wrapped her hands around the mug, letting the heat seep into her frozen bones. She watched as Jose stood behind the tech, a dark monolith looming over the glowing screens. "I'm in," the tech announced, his fingers flying across the keyboard, extracting the root directory. "Holy hell. Report," Jose demanded. It's a shadow network." "Boss," the tech stammered, his eyes wide as rapid lines of data scrolled across the screens. Vance wasn't just skimming the shipping manifests. He created a parallel logistics company using our shell corporations. He's been routing 20% of all incoming medical supplies, pharmaceuticals, and raw chemicals to his own private warehouses, then selling them back to our distributors at a premium. He's effectively taxing your entire operation. Jose didn't move, but the air around him seemed to solidify. How long? The ledgers go back 4 years, the tech said, swallowing hard. The total volume. Boss, he's embezzled close to $80 million. Alexa gasped softly from the sofa. 80 million. The 80,000 he had stolen from her brother was literally a rounding error in his massive scheme. Pull up the expenditure logs, Jose commanded, his voice dead flat. Where is he hiding the capital? The tech typed frantically. Multiple offshore accounts. Cayman, Cyprus, Seychelles. But, wait, there's a massive domestic expenditure file here. It's not hidden. It's listed under philanthropy. He's been funneling massive donations through a shell charity. Jose leaned closer to the screen, his hands gripping the back of the tech's chair so hard the metal groaned. Show me the recipient. A document flashed onto the center screen. It was a scanned receipt for a multi-million-dollar donation, complete with corporate logos and signatures. Alexa looked up from her tea. She saw the document on the screen, and then she saw Jose's reaction. The imposing, terrifying warlord seemed to physically shrink. He staggered backward, his hand flying to his chest as if he had been shot. All the color drained from his granite face, leaving a mask of absolute, paralyzing horror. He stared at the screen, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Alexa slowly stood up, letting the blanket fall to the floor. She walked tentatively toward the monitors, her eyes drawn to the name of the recipient hospital on the document. It was St. Jude's Memorial, the exact same hospital where her brother was currently lying, fighting for his life. The silence in the penthouse was absolute. A vacuum created by the sudden, catastrophic implosion of Jose's stoic facade. He stood frozen, his eyes locked on the glowing logo of St. Jude's Memorial Hospital on the screen. The tech pushed his chair back slowly, terrified by the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere, sensing he had uncovered something infinitely more dangerous than stolen money. Alexa stepped closer, her eyes darting between the screen and the Mafia boss. That's where my brother is, she whispered, the coincidence feeling too heavy, too dark to be random. St. Jude's. The pediatric wing. Jose didn't look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the ledger, but his eyes were seeing something years in the past. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow, stripped of all its commanding resonance, leaving only the brittle rasp of an old, unhealed wound. 3 years ago, Jose began, speaking to the screen, to the ghost in the machine. St. Jude's opened a new neonatal intensive care unit, a state-of-the-art facility. It was funded entirely by anonymous donations from my holding companies. It was an attempt to build something clean in a dirty world. He slowly reached out and touched the monitor, his scarred finger tracing the edge of the digital document. My wife went into early labor, he continued, the words tearing out of him like rusted nails. Complications. We rushed her to that specific unit because I had ensured it had the best equipment in the world, the finest ventilators, the most advanced monitoring systems. Money was no object. I bought them the best. He stopped. A tremor racked his massive frame. He closed his eyes, and a single, silent tear tracked down his weathered cheek. The sight of it was deeply unnatural, terrifying in its vulnerability. The ventilators failed, Jose whispered, the sound barely carrying over the hum of the servers. A catastrophic power sequence error. The backup batteries didn't engage. The monitoring systems didn't sound the alarms until it was too late. My wife, my son, they both suffocated in a room I built to save them. Alexa felt the air leave her lungs. The horror of the story paralyzed her. The hospital claimed it was a tragic manufacturing defect. A 1 in a million malfunction, Jose said, his eyes snapping open. The sorrow vanished instantly, replaced by a raging, infernal fury that made the room feel dangerously small. He leaned over the tech, opened the procurement logs for that donation. Track the serial numbers of the medical equipment Vance purchased for St. Jude's. The tech scrambled back to the keyboard, his hands shaking so badly he missed keys. He ran the cross-reference. A new window populated on the screen, detailing purchase orders, shipping manifests, and manufacturer origins. The text stared at the results, his face turning an ashen gray. He looked up at Jose, pure terror in his eyes. Boss, Vance didn't buy the top-tier equipment you authorized. He bought discontinued, surplus units from a defunct medical supplier in Eastern Europe. They were known to have faulty power relays. He paid 10 cents on the dollar. The tech swallowed hard and pocketed the difference. He forged the inspection certificates. The revelation detonated in the room. David Vance hadn't just stolen money from a cartel. His greed had directly caused the death of the boss's wife and child. He had built a fortune on the graves of the people Jose loved most. Jose took a slow step backward. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal, the profound cosmic cruelty of it, seemed to shatter something fundamental inside him. He turned away from the monitors and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the city lights bleeding through the rain. Alexa stood paralyzed. The man she had thought was just a petty thief was a monster of unimaginable proportions. He had condemned Jose's family for a profit margin, and now he had stolen her brother's life fund. The parallel was sickening. They were both victims of the exact same parasitic greed. She walked slowly toward Jose, stopping a few feet behind him. The heavily armed guards watched her, but nobody moved to stop her. He told me the surgery was too expensive, Alexa said softly to his broad back. When my brother got sick, David said it was a lost cause. He said the money would be better spent starting a new life together. When I refused, he emptied the account and left. She wrapped her arms around herself, the cashmere blanket falling away. He doesn't care who dies. He only sees numbers. Jose didn't turn around. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass. For 3 years, I blamed the universe, he murmured. I blamed God. I blamed myself for bringing a child into this life. But it wasn't God. It was a rat I allowed into my own house. He finally turned to face her. The look in his eyes was apocalyptic. It was a cold, calculated void that promised a reckoning of biblical proportions. The warlord had returned, but his purpose had shifted from protecting his empire to executing pure, unadulterated vengeance. He stole your brother's future to line his pockets, Jose said, his voice a low, lethal hum that vibrated in the glass. He stole my family's lives to build his foundation. Tomorrow, David Vance will cease to exist. But tonight, he looked at the phone in his hand, then back at Alexa. Tonight, you are going to invite him to his own funeral. The plan was forged in the cold, sterile light of the penthouse, driven by a mutual, devastating need for retribution. David Vance was a ghost within the city, heavily protected by his own stolen wealth and the paranoid security protocols he had designed for the cartel. Hunting him down could take weeks, time that Alexa's brother did not have, and time that Jose's fury would not abide. They needed him to step out into the light voluntarily. They needed bait, and Alexa was the only bait he would ever take. Jose's tech team isolated a secure, burner frequency and spoofed Alexa's phone number, ensuring the message would appear to come from her destroyed device without revealing their location. Alexa sat at the glass table, a pristine, newly activated smartphone placed in front of her. Her hands were shaking. The reality of what she was about to do, luring a man to his execution, warred with the terrifying knowledge of what he had done to her. And to the man standing behind her. Keep it simple. Keep it desperate, Jose instructed, standing just outside her peripheral vision. He believes you are alone, terrified, and cornered. Play to his arrogance. Tell him you panicked when my men arrived. Tell him you ran, and you still have the drive. Alexa nodded slowly. She typed the message, her fingers pausing over the keys as she crafted the deception. David, please. Men in black cars came to the diner. I ran. I still have the drive. I'm so scared. I don't want to go to the police anymore. Just give me the $80K for his surgery and you can have it back. I just want my brother to live. Meet me at the old shipping yards. Dock 4. Come alone or I swear I'll smash it. She read it aloud. The desperation in the words tasted like ash, but it was authentic because the fear was real. Send it, Jose said softly. She pressed the button. The silence in the penthouse stretched tight, like a wire about to snap. They waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Alexa felt nausea rolling in her stomach. What if he didn't care? What if he just let her be killed by the cartel he thought was hunting her? Suddenly, the phone chimed. A single text appeared. You stupid bitch. You brought the wolves to the door. Dock 4, 1 hour. If you bring anyone, or if you don't have the drive, I will personally go to Street Pables, Jude's, and unplug his machines myself. Alexa gasped, dropping the phone onto the glass table as if it had burned her. The sheer venomous cruelty of the threat ripped through her. He was threatening a dying child in a hospital bed. Jose leaned over the table, reading the text. A dark, terrifying smile curved the corners of his mouth. It was the smile of a predator watching the trap snap shut. He took the bait, Jose said, turning away to face his men. The air in the room instantly electrified. Mobilize the strike teams. Blackout protocols. I want Dock 4 locked down from a half-mile out. No one enters. No one leaves. Snipers on the gantry cranes. I want him boxed in a cage he cannot see until the door shuts. The convoy rolled out 20 minutes later. Alexa rode in the lead SUV with Jose. The silence between them was different now. It was no longer the silence of a captor and a hostage, but the heavy, solemn quiet of two people walking together toward the edge of a cliff. The shipping yards at Dock 4 were a desolate, rusting graveyard of maritime industry. Massive, rusted shipping containers were stacked like brutalist skyscrapers, creating a labyrinth of deep shadows and narrow, echoing corridors. The rain had slowed to a miserable drizzle, coating the slick, oily asphalt in a reflective sheen. The SUVs cut their lights a mile out, navigating the maze in pitch blackness using night vision. They stopped deep within the stacks. Jose turned to Alexa. You will stand in the open clearing between the cranes, Jose said, his voice steady and calm. You will be entirely visible. He will sweep the area with thermals before he approaches. He will see you are alone. But understand this, you are not alone. My men have every angle covered. I will be less than 50 feet away, in the shadows. He will not touch you. Alexa swallowed her terror and nodded. She stepped out of the warm SUV and into the freezing, damp air. She walked alone down a long alley of rusted steel, stepping out into a wide, open clearing bathed in the pale light of a single flickering sodium lamp. She stood there, feeling smaller and more vulnerable than she ever had in her life. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant lapping of the harbor water. 10 minutes passed. Her teeth began to chatter. Then she heard it. The slow, confident purr of a high-end sports car engine. A sleek silver coupe slinked out from behind a stack of containers, its headlights blinding her. It stopped 20 yards away. The engine died. The driver's side door opened, and David Vance stepped out into the light. He was impeccably dressed, arrogant, and radiating a smug, reptilian confidence. He held a suppressed pistol casually in his right hand. He looked around the empty clearing, laughing softly. You really are an idiot, Alexa, David called out, his voice echoing off the steel walls. Did you really think I'd just hand you 80 grand and walk away? I'm going to take the drive, and then I'm going to put a bullet in your head. Alexa stood her ground, her heart hammering wildly. She looked at the man who had destroyed her life. And for the first time, she didn't feel fear. She felt pity. He had no idea what was waiting for him in the dark. I don't have the drive, David, Alexa said, her voice remarkably clear, ringing through the damp air. I gave it to the man you stole it from. David stopped dead in his tracks. The smug smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of confusion, and then a dawning, absolute terror. As the shadows around the clearing began to move, the realization hit David Vance like a physical blow. The solitary figure of the waitress in the flickering light was not a victim begging for scraps. She was the tether to a colossal, unseen predator. Before he could raise the pistol, before he could even turn to run toward his car, the darkness surrounding the clearing dissolved. Dozens of laser sights suddenly pierced the gloom, a chaotic web of red dots converging simultaneously on David's chest, head, and limbs. The mechanical clacking of 50 assault rifles chambering rounds echoed like thunder through the shipping containers. The trap had sprung, not with violence, but with an overwhelming, paralyzing display of absolute power. From the deep shadows directly behind David, a figure stepped forward. Jose walked into the pale light of the sodium lamp. He didn't hold a weapon. He didn't need one. His presence alone sucked the oxygen from the air. David spun around, dropping the suppressed pistol to the wet asphalt as if it were white-hot. His knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the slick ground, scrambling backward like a cornered rat. "Jose," he whimpered, his voice cracking, completely stripped of its former arrogance. "Boss, please. I can explain. It was a misunderstanding. I was protecting the assets." Jose didn't stop walking until he was standing directly over the trembling man. He looked down at David with a gaze so devoid of humanity it made Alexa shiver from 20 yards away. "You bought discontinued ventilators from a bankrupt supplier in Minsk," Jose said, his voice a low, terrifying whisper that carried clearly across the quiet yard. "You forged the safety certifications. You saved $3 million. David's eyes widened in absolute horror. He realized instantly that Jose knew everything. The stolen shipments, the offshore accounts, the embezzlement, all of it was irrelevant compared to this singular, fatal sin. "Boss, I didn't know," David sobbed, raising his hands defensively. "I swear to God, I didn't know they were for the neonatal unit. I didn't know your family was there. It was just business. It was just a margin." "A margin," Jose repeated softly. He crouched down, bringing his face inches from David's pale, sweating forehead. "My son's last breath was a margin to you. My wife's terror was a margin." Jose reached out and gently laid a hand on David's shoulder. The touch seemed to paralyze the traitor entirely. "There is no explanation, David. There is no business. There is only the debt, and you are going to pay it." Jose stood up and turned his back on the weeping man. He looked across the clearing at Alexa. He gave her a single, slow nod. "Take him." Jose commanded quietly to the darkness. Two massive men stepped out of the shadows, hoisted David to his feet by his armpits, and dragged him screaming into the labyrinth of shipping containers. Alexa turned away, closing her eyes as the terrified pleading faded into the heavy, damp night. She knew what was coming, but she felt no remorse. The universe was simply rebalancing a horrific equation. Jose walked slowly across the wet asphalt toward her. The terrifying aura of the warlord seemed to dissipate with every step, leaving behind a man who looked profoundly exhausted, carrying a weight that had crushed him for years. "It is done," Jose said, his voice quiet and hollow. Alexa looked up at him. "The money? The accounts? My tech team is draining them as we speak," Jose replied. "Every cent he stole, every asset he hid. It will be reabsorbed." He paused, looking down at her shivering frame. He took off his heavy, bespoke trench coat and draped it over her shoulders. The warmth and the scent of expensive cologne enveloped her. "And the surgery fund will be restored tenfold." The transition from the nightmare of the shipping yard to the sterile bright lights of St. Jude's Memorial Hospital felt like crossing into a different dimension. Dawn was breaking over the city as Jose's armored SUV pulled up to the emergency entrance. Jose escorted her inside. The hospital staff, usually bureaucratic and slow, moved with terrified efficiency when they saw the imposing man in the tailored suit flank the exhausted waitress. Within an hour, a team of top-tier pediatric surgeons had been mobilized. The outstanding medical bills were cleared with a single, untraceable wire transfer. Her brother was prepped and moved to the finest surgical suite in the building. Alexa stood by the large glass window of the intensive care unit, watching the doctors prepare her sleeping brother. The crippling, suffocating weight she had carried for months was gone, replaced by a strange, numb exhaustion. She felt a presence beside her. Jose stood at the window, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the medical team work. He looked at the advanced monitors, the humming ventilators, top-of-the-line equipment that his money and his wrath had ensured were now flawless. "They say he will make a full recovery," Jose said softly, his eyes fixed on the small boy. "Thank you," Alexa whispered, the words feeling entirely inadequate for the magnitude of what had transpired. "You saved his life. You saved mine." Jose finally turned to look at her. The harsh, granite lines of his face had softened. The void in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, mournful peace. He had exacted his vengeance, but in saving her brother, he had found something closer to redemption. "You saved yourself, Alexa," Jose replied. "You walked into the dark for someone you loved. You accidentally called a monster to your door, and you forced him to remember that he used to be a man." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, blank business card with a single phone number embossed on it. He handed it to her. "If the world ever closes in on you again," he said, his voice a gentle, unwavering promise, "do not text. Call." He turned and walked away, his heavy footsteps echoing down the pristine hospital corridor. Vanishing back into the shadows of the city he ruled, Alexa stood by the window, clutching the card, watching her brother breathe, knowing that while the world was dark and full of monsters, she had somehow befriended the devil, and he had given her an angel's miracle. Sometimes, the greatest mistakes are the miracles we never knew we needed. Alexa pressed send in a moment of blinding despair, believing she was writing her own tragic ending. Instead, she summoned the one force in the city powerful enough to rewrite her fate. Out of the shadows of fear and betrayal, an unexpected protector emerged, proving that even in the darkest corners of the world, a desperate plea for a loved one can bridge impossible divides. If this story of accidental courage and unexpected redemption kept you on the edge of your seat, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more cinematic, real-life dramatic stories.